the last speaker of the morning, Ken Tupper. I have a salon that I hold monthly for 15 years, and it's about science and technology and philosophy and things like that. And I asked Ken, since he was coming into town a day early, if he would speak at it, and he did. And I tell you, I've been doing this with a partner for 15 years, and I think, without exaggerating, Ken's was probably the best, in my opinion. Now, no pressure there, Ken. But I was incredibly impressed with Ken's work, and that's why we brought him in. Let me read his bio. Ken Tupper is an adjunct professor in the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia. His scholarly interests include psychedelic studies, the cross-cultural and historic uses of psychoactive substances, public, professional, and school-based drug education, and creating healthy public policy for currently illegal drugs. Kenneth's doctoral research developed the concept of entheogenic education, a theoretical frame for understanding how psychedelic plants and substances can function as cognitive tools for learning.
Thanks, Neal, and thanks, Kevin, for inviting me to speak, and for all of you for coming out. I want to start with this photo, which is a photo of my home. It's where my parents were born and my grandparents were born. And I'll make a few remarks about my grandfather, after whom I was named. He was also Dr. Kenneth Tupper. He was a preeminent Canadian scientist. He was the vice president of the National Research Council of Canada. He was the dean of engineering at the University of Toronto. He actually purchased the first computer for the University of Toronto in the 1950s. And my father kind of followed in his footsteps, also taught at a post-secondary institution in technology, taught photogrammetry. And so I was raised to be a scientist. And for my childhood and early teens, thought, that was the royal road to truth. So pretty much most of the issues have been solved. There's a few loose ends to tie up, but science was definitely going to get us there. And then in my mid-teens, I had some experiences that I'm sure most of you can relate to, that challenged my belief that science had all of the ways of knowing that we're valuable in the world. And that really sort of opened my mind. I went on and studied philosophy, because I thought, there's no more urgent questions to study than those of epistemology and ontology and metaphysics. And became interested in, explaining what experiences I'd gone through and why they weren't valued more in our culture. So I began to do some reading, learned that there was a long tradition historically in our own culture. Even within the Judeo-Christian tradition, the fruit of the tree of knowledge talked about in the Old Testament, perhaps an entheogenic allegory, fruit that gave one knowledge of the gods. The use of soma in the Indo-Aryan cultures, the use of kykeon or some kind of entheogenic substance in the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece. But then there was a long period of alienation from states of consciousness like these for 1,500 years, other than alcohol intoxication. And of course, the repression by religious and ecclesiastical authorities in the form of burning witches and, of course, indigenous traditions. The more I learned about some of those indigenous traditions, however, the more interested I became in the metaphor of plant teachers that I kept coming across. And so I thought, when I was thinking of going to graduate school, having done some teaching, thinking I would do it in education, that I'd really be interested in pursuing a thesis on the educational value of psychedelic plants and chemicals, and trying to unpack this metaphor of plant teachers. And of course I knew about the claims in the 1960s of creativity and cognitive enhancement and mind expansion. So part of what I started to explore when I began this is the alienation from experiences of wonder and awe, which began actually in the 18th century with the rise of the Enlightenment. I recommend this book by Lorraine Daston and Catherine Park called Wonders in the Order of Nature. They talked about how with the rise of the scientific Enlightenment, wonder became kind of vulgar. So this quote, wonder in natural philosophy, natural philosophy was the term that was used for science at that time. Science wasn't really what we understand it today. Wonder in natural philosophy smacked of the disruptive forces of enthusiasm and superstition in religion and politics. Thus, central to the new secular meaning of enlightenment as a state of mind and a way of life was the rejection of the marvelous. And this is a tragedy in some ways, as wonder and awe are vital emotions for the human experience, for optimal education and development, for finding meaning and purpose in life. But in many ways, they're counter to modern values of efficiency, profitability, or technical rationality. Maybe either a symptom or a cause of what Weber called the disenchantment of modernity. We've seen a kind of move to re-enchantment through things like television, video games, malls, theme parks, etc. And schools have been part of that systematic repression of wonder and awe. Public schooling, of course, is a very new institution. It's only around 150 years old in the way that we know it. Of course, privileges reason and rationality and almost an ideology of what is known as scientism, where contemporary scientists in some ways have forgotten the sort of unorthodox approaches to knowing that their forebears in the early modern period brought. And so wonder and awe are not cultivated in schools in the way that might be valuable, particularly through things like the architecture, the regimen, the discipline. Now we see medications where kids who are displaying certain kinds of characteristics are medicated to make them more normal. I drew on the work of one of my professors, Kieran Egan, who wrote a great book called The Educated Mind. He talked about the conflicted aims of schooling, arguing that schools are trying to do several things at once and does none of them very effectively. So on the one hand, they're trying to socialize, get young people to grow up and be factory workers and have 2.3 kids and white picket fence. On the other hand, they've got this ambition of Platonic truth-seeking coming out of ancient Greece, but obviously that's kind of in conflict with the socialization element. There's the self-actualization coming out of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the idea of allowing the organic child to flourish and find themselves, but also kind of in conflict with the first two. I would also add to this the public health function that's been further and further embedded in schools. So Kieran Egan asks if there's perhaps another way to conceive of what it means to be educated. And he drew on the ideas of a Soviet psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, who developed what's known as cultural historical school of philosophy and the extended theory of mind. And Vygotsky was really sort of an advocate of understanding how cognitive tools are important in our development as individuals and as cultures. So for Vygotsky, the primordial cognitive tools were literacy and numeracy, but then other examples were maps, or mnemonic techniques, scientific instruments, things like abacuses, and of course now computers. But my question or query in my work was perhaps could we think of psychoactive substances as cognitive tools, particularly psychedelics, and could that metaphor be helpful in framing the way we think about these things and the potential risks or benefits, understanding them as tools. So Egan's ways, and if you go and check out his book, he talks about perhaps thinking of a fully educated person as having 5 types of understanding that he sees as kind of developmental in human cultural through early pre-civilization, through early civilization, and into the sort of modern period. So somatic understanding is pre-linguistics, or rooted in the body. The mythic understanding is related to orality and the poetic or narrative storytelling function of traditional cultures. The romantic understanding was tied up with literacy, and where we started to look at limits or extremes of experience. Philosophic understanding, the development of science and looking for patterns, principles, and theories. And then in our sort of postmodern age, the ironic understanding, the collapse of meta-narratives. So he suggested that, as we move through these types of understanding, often we kind of forget the earlier ones and focus on the more recent ones. But suggesting that to be fully educated, we'd be sort of have facility in all of these types of understandings and deploy the appropriate tools for those understanding. So I wanted to focus on particularly the somatic and the mythic types of understanding that I thought were kind of missing in our contemporary educational systems. And that perhaps, again, the psychedelics or plant teachers could be these kinds of cognitive tools to develop these ways of thinking. In addition to Kieran Egan's work, I looked at Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. He wrote a book called Frames of Mind, where he was critiquing the mainstream sort of understanding of intelligence, the IQ tests, as focused largely on two types of intelligence: logical, mathematical, and linguistics, or linguistic intelligence. But he said he thought there was at least 7, so 5 additional ones: spatial intelligence, musical intelligence, kinesthetic, interpersonal, and interpersonal. And after he came out with it, it was quite influential in some educational circles. People began to approach him and ask, are there only 7? Could there be other types of intelligence? So in 1999, he updated his thinking on this, suggesting that perhaps there's a naturalist intelligence. And he said, in traditional cultures, it would be sort of knowing all of the different types of plants or animals in your environment, being able to categorize them well. In a contemporary world, it might be knowing cars. There's people know makes and models of all different types of cars, so they've got this sort of way of understanding the world, a gift in that way. He said people approached him about a spiritual intelligence, and he wasn't willing to go there, but he entertained the idea of an existential intelligence. But he wasn't fully committed. He joked about having perhaps there's 8.5 intelligences. He wasn't willing to commit to the existential intelligence. He had a set of criteria, which I won't go through here, but he said, it met some of them. So I took his idea of existential intelligence, and here's his definition of it. It involves having a heightened capacity to appreciate and attend to the cosmological enigmas that define the human condition, an exceptional awareness of the metaphysical, ontological, and epistemological mysteries that have been a perennial concern for people of all cultures. So I took his criteria for what constitutes an intelligence and said, if we can conceive of psychoactive, psychedelic, and entheogenic substances as cognitive tools, perhaps we can better appreciate how they validate the idea of an existential intelligence. And sort of explored this in a paper that was ultimately published in the Canadian Journal of Education, which is a fairly conservative education journal. So I was pleased to have that accepted in venue. Of course, this idea wasn't mine originally. I'm sure it goes back far more historically than this, but I first sort of came across this actually reading books in my teens. Aldous Huxley's book Island was a big sort of game changer in my thinking about the world. But I came across this quote that he had specifically on education. In 1953, he wrote, "Under the current dispensation, the vast majority of individuals lose, in the course of education, all the openness to inspiration, all the capacity to be aware of other things than those enumerated in the Sears Roebuck catalog, which constitutes the conventionally real world. Is it too much to hope that a system of education may someday be devised which shall give results in terms of human development, commensurate with the time, money, energy, and devotion expended? In such a system of education, it may be that mescaline or some other chemical substance may play a part in making it possible for young people to taste and see what they have learned about at second hand in the writings of the religious or the works of poets, painters, and musicians." So I think it's beautiful. I think what he's describing here is again becoming facile in the area of existential intelligence. And of course, the latest neuroscience research is now corroborating some of these speculations. So the work of Catherine McLean and her colleagues at Johns Hopkins, psilocybin has been associated with increased openness, it's one of the big 5 personality traits. And then more recently with LSD, openness and optimism found to be enhanced in Robin Carhart-Harris's lab. Ayahuasca has been associated with increased mindfulness capacity and with divergent thinking and creativity. Of course, not just, and that's use of psychedelics in controlled clinical settings. Other research on population level data on psychedelics that are used in non-medical settings, i.e. for recreational, have been associated with reduced suicidality, reduced recidivism, and reduced intimate partner violence. So there's, I think, more and more scientific evidence coming from various avenues to point us in the direction of thinking beyond the healing function, which of course is tremendously valuable, but it may be that there's an even greater value in the non-medical or non-therapeutic benefits of these substances used, I think, in carefully controlled contexts where I think looking again at traditional indigenous cultural practices as the model, if these are tools that have real power, then we need to respect them as tools. A knife in the hands of a skilled chef or a master chef or a skilled surgeon can do miracles, but a knife in the hands of a child who thinks it's a toy can be potentially dangerous. So looking again at the traditional indigenous ritual practices, ritual is a set of ordered, repetitious behavior, a collective symbolic action. It's a primordial social activity, often involving intergenerational education, so elders model responsible use. It's a form of liminal experience, often a rite of passage, again, something I think that's lacking in contemporary modern culture. And the ritual itself is a form of proto-harm reduction for psychoactive substance use, a safe container that's set that minimizes potential risks and maximizes potential benefits. So where might we go from all of this? There's a bit of a retrospective of where I've come from in my own thinking and academic work. In terms of the future, well, obviously more research is needed. We need healthy human subject clinical studies, both, again, therapeutic and non-therapeutic. Population data set analysis, the work that Peter Hendricks has done and other colleagues, I'm sure there's a lot more that could be done looking at associations with psychedelic use and other types of behaviors or health outcomes. Microdosing obviously is a popular topic these days. It would be great to see some solid research to explore where that might take us. And then to do more work on traditional indigenous knowledge practices. In terms of education, public education, so that's school-based, mass media, alternative media, conferences like this are a great opportunity for helping people understand the potential benefits of these substances, because most people are only schooled in the harms that they've heard about for decades. And this includes, of course, professional education. I work with a lot of physicians, and I find often they're the group that are most ignorant about the history of psychedelics and the contemporary research on psychedelics. So there's a lot of work to be done in various professional groups, doctors, nurses, social workers, teachers, to help them understand the history of their own profession in some cases. A lot don't know that LSD was once a promising psychiatric medication that had real positive health outcomes for treating things like alcoholism or certain kinds of mental illnesses. The harm reduction project, Jag talked about this morning, so psychedelic emergency response is going to be important because people will continue to use these things in less controlled settings, such as big parties. Drug checking, or testing samples of drugs for and analyzing them for their contents. In Canada recently, there was a blotter paper discovered with, this was a seizure by police, blotter paper discovered with carfentanil, which is an analog of fentanyl, which is itself an analog of heroin, or a much more potent form. Carfentanil is used essentially in veterinary medicine for sedating elephants, but very, very, very potent opioid that can kill people in tiny amounts. And so to find it on blotter paper is very disturbing. User forums where people can share knowledge, places such as, or sites such as Earwood and Blue Light. And again, the Symposia group and other destigmatization or coming out efforts to further sort of legitimize and destigmatize people who use these substances. In terms of public policy, looking at indigenous rights, the political, territorial, cultural rights of indigenous people, lobbying elected officials, talking to your politicians, influencing political party platforms, influencing professional organizations. So if you are a professional, go and talk to your board or your college, physicians, nurses, psychologists, teachers, etc., and educate them a little bit. Bring some, print out some scientific articles and bring them along and share them. Engage health system leaders, funding agency officials, and other bureaucrats. There's lots of informal power structures that exist where these ideas can be shared and perhaps influenced, and then general social movement building. In terms of public policy writ large, I think there's a lot of work to be done in looking where we can go from our currently failed war on drugs. This is a paper that I recently published or co-authored and published with colleagues in British Columbia, looking at a public health-based vision for the management and regulation of psychedelics. It's one vision. It's not necessarily the only or the best. I mean, it's one that we think holds a lot of water in terms of again, potentially balancing risks and benefits. But certainly it's just a trial balloon to offer some ideas about where we might go. I'm sure there's some who would critique some of the ideas we put forward here, but I urge people to check it out, and if you don't like it, articulate your own vision, because we need lots of voices to come together to come up with ideas that are going to, as a collective, will be better than individuals. And because I work in education and I'm interested in drug education, one of the big fears about this is mixed messages. I think that the real mixed message is the cultural attitudes that we have that encourage young people to say yes to all of the instant gratifications. They say yes to the Coca-Cola, Nike running shoes, burgers, but then expect them to say no to the sometimes real pleasures or insights that can come from the use of drugs is very sort of unrealistic or at odds with what they're hearing in the more dominant cultural narrative. And that addictions to things like money and debt, because money and debt are actually identical, and cheap petroleum energy are perhaps the biggest social issues. I refer to the work of one of my professors, Dr. Bruce Alexander, who wrote a great book called The Globalization of Addiction. If you're interested in exploring, how addictions are a much broader issue than just the narrow sort of drug addictions that we typically focus on, and the dislocation that we all face as denizens of the modern world. And then looking at traditional indigenous wisdom practices and the idea that learning from plant teachers or other entheogens or psychedelics may be crucial in shifting our thinking in this regard. Thank you. So my grandfather, Dr. Kenneth Tupper, told me when I was about 10 years old that there was a report that had been written by a think tank in Europe called the Club of Rome, and the report was called The Limits to Growth. And I remember him telling me this was around 1980, so the report was published in 1972, that it was the most important thing that my generation was going to have to deal with. And after I didn't think much about it at the time, but I did remember that, and have since learned a whole lot more about that, and the fact that it was widely criticized by economists and sort of ignored, essentially. But it stuck with me, and I certainly had a kind of ecological sensibility in much of my work and thinking, and to thinking about the potential value of these kinds of substances, entheogens, psychedelics. And I want to bring us back to this photograph, which I grew up knowing, but my parents didn't, my grandparents didn't. Because this photograph, of course, was only taken after the launch of the space program. But the beautiful story behind this, some of you may know, is that before it was seen, this image was released publicly by NASA, it was envisioned by a guy named Stuart Brand, one of the merry pranksters, who has a story about sitting on a roof, having taken LSD, and having a sort of looking on the horizon, and if I recall, he said he saw the buildings were not quite orthogonal, or not quite parallel, they were kind of orthogonal to the earth. He thought he was perceiving the curvature of the earth, and sort of imagined himself up on top of the building he was on and looking down over the building, and then higher up looking down over the neighborhood. This is in San Francisco. Then he was higher up looking over the whole Bay Area, and then even higher up looking over the west coast of the United States. And he said he imagined himself going further and further and further until he said he imagined himself out in space looking back at this image. And he thought, I've never seen this image, but it must exist. This is in 1966 or so. So he started a button campaign saying, why haven't we seen a photo of the Earth from space yet? Sent it to Congress people, and went to rock festivals and gave it out. And it was within a year or so that NASA released this image for the first time publicly. But the interesting thing that Stuart Brand said is he realized right away the iconic significance that this was going to have, that this image was so powerful. And I think it's a beautiful illustration of the potential value of these kinds of substances, to have that kind of creative insight about something so crucial. And so I just sort of hope that's an inspirational type of story that can help us think about how these kinds of things might be integrated in the future, and help us come to terms with the spaceship Earth that we need to be taking care of. So I'm going to leave it there, and we'll welcome any questions or comments.
Ken Tupper. Thank you, Ken. Thank you. So who would like to speak with Ken? Sir.
Be interested in hearing reactions from colleagues about your article in the educational journal. Did you get a lot of criticism or support or both?
That's a great question. So when I started my master's program in 1999, and I was lucky to find a couple of professors, including a professor of Indigenous Studies, who were supportive of what I was trying to do. There was nobody sort of expert in the area of entheogenic education. Actually, there was one person, Tom Roberts, at the University of Northern Illinois, I had corresponded with, and he was interested in education and psychedelics. But I ended up going to Simon Fraser University in my hometown, and so I did manage to find a committee that was willing to support me in pursuing this. And so that was supportive, but I definitely had lots of criticisms from others, colleagues or other students and some professors. Most often it was kind of bemusement and sort of just not paying any attention to me. Not that much active antagonism. Fortunately, I was told it was career suicide. That I would never get a job. That if I wanted to pursue this, maybe as a junior professor or a postdoc, but to do it as a master's thesis was, as I say, career suicide. But my response to them was, well, I'm not here to get a job. Actually, I'm here because I've got an interest and a passion in something. And isn't that what graduate school is supposed to be about? So they didn't have much to say to that. But then, with respect to that. With respect to that journal publication, I actually met the editor, it was Canadian Journal of Education. I met the editor a couple of years later at a conference, and he told me that it was the most controversial manuscript that they'd ever received. It was a huge debate among the editorial staff about whether to accept it for publication. It had some positive reviews and some very negative. I think one of the comments from one of the negatives was this was morally abhorrent to suggest that drugs could be educational. But they said they'd made a decision a year or two earlier to be taking on a bit more controversy and trying to sort of push the envelope. So they did accept it in the end. So I was lucky, I guess, to be sort of in the right place at the right time to advance these ideas. So thank you.
I'm just curious how you view this subject in relation to the massive proliferation of amphetamines and other type of study or learning drugs, if you can even call it learning relative to the subject matter you've been discussing.
I think for some individuals, the drugs like Adderall or Ritalin are very helpful. My understanding is they're probably widely overprescribed. And then I would question, the etiology of attention deficit disorder. What is it about the modern condition that leads to attention deficit? So perhaps some of the technological things like lots of screens in our culture. Perhaps there's other factors that are playing into this. It's not just a pure neurocognitive developmental issue. So I think that often it's masking symptoms of other types of broader social cultural issues, and we use medications to dampen things down and again make kids more normal and conform and help. Obviously, teachers are overburdened in the classroom, large classes of kids, so to keep them under control, it can be helpful to have them medicated. So I understand that there's other forces at work. So it's a complex issue, but I would say it's a challenging one. We need to think about perhaps other non-pharmaceutical alternatives to some of those issues.
Another question.
Hey, thanks for your presentation. So let's assume that your 10-year plan comes true, right? And so we study microdosing, and it turns out that it works for a lot of people. We study traditional medicine, indigenous rituals, things along those lines, and begin to implement them in society, and groups like Symposia and others popular, begin to gain membership, become more popular, get integrated into their communities. And the United States government basically says, this all seems to look pretty good. We were wrong. Let's give it a shot. You guys are right. Let's begin to implement these things in our society. What would it look like after those 10 years? What if those 10 years were successful?
Well, I mean, my own definition of success would be more than just sort of legalization or legal access to these things. I think it would be a massive socioeconomic transformation to create a system of social justice and economic justice globally, where economy and ecology are truly synonymous, right now they're completely, there's as much relation between ecology and economy as there is between astrology and astronomy today. Although I think we've got it backwards. We think economy is what's real and solid and quantifiable, and ecology is this kind of hippy-dippy mumbo-jumbo thing. I would suggest that it's the other way around, and that we're going to, at our own peril, learn that the hard way. So I think my utopian, I guess, roots would be that there's going to be a much bigger transformation than just ending the war on drugs. That it's going to be a much bigger systemic change.
We have a question over here.
What about cannabis? What about cannabis? And what I mean by that is, as a fellow Canadian, recreationally legal across the country. On November, more states are coming online. I personally feel cannabis is one of the very important plant teachers that expands consciousness. And with legality, why not be a lot more stronger and bolder about working with teens and seeing how cannabis and different strands of cannabis expand consciousness or alter consciousness? So that's the general gist of my question.
Yeah, so I had other people have asked me that. My interest was much more in the sort of classical psychedelics. I felt cannabis had its own sort of political advocacy voice behind it at the time that I began working in this area. So I just decided not to pay so much attention to it. I'm not going to comment more on cannabis other than that I think the war on drugs has been a failure. In Canada right now we're putting in place a legal regime. We'll see how it's still being developed, so we'll see what it plays out as. But looking at places like Washington, Colorado as models for that. So yeah, thanks for the comment, for sure. And cannabis has been used entheogenically for sure in many different cultures. So I would put it in, but it's in a different pharmacological class than the ones that I was particularly interested in.
Another question here.
I'm a Canadian, old enough to remember at age 15 the headlines that came into our house, LSD being studied in Saskatchewan for schizophrenia, but yet I never had any access to these things. How do I begin at the age of 78?
I wish I had a good answer for that question. I'm not, unfortunately, in a position to be able to recommend sources of currently controlled substances. I guess look around for potential research opportunity, as a subject in a trial at some point. But yeah, that's obviously a challenge right now, is that they aren't legally accessible. So.
I bet you just made several hundred friends, though, right? A question over there on the other side.
Thank you. Sure. Hi. First of all, two questions. First one's stupid. What's your name again? I'm sorry, I just wanted to write it down in my notes. Oh, mine, perfect. Okay, well, the second one, in 2013, James Fadiman did a study on problem solving in relation to something you were pretty much speaking on, in which he found that 40 out of the 44 participants that he was working with were able to get around their problems. I was just wondering, would your research later on be going into critical pedagogy and education in general, or could it extend to general problem solving and its applications in like a professional sense?
So yeah, I'm aware of Jim Fadiman and his work, and of course, it's great that he's continuing to keep alive the stuff that he began back in the 60s. My agenda in my own work was really to create the discursive space for talking about the idea of plant teachers and psychedelics as cognitive tools. I haven't got any kind of research program to do this kind of work in a lab setting and to do sort of quantitative analysis of things. I would love to see that happen, but really my work's been more philosophy of education and to just sort of open up the context for having these discussions and not keep everything framed on, again, medical and therapeutic uses of these things are fantastic and I'm super supportive, but I'd love to see the conversation extended more broadly. And I understand that's happening elsewhere. And Jim Fadiman's obviously a great advocate of that line of thinking as well. And as I mentioned, Tom Roberts as well. So thanks.
Lots of questions. That's a good thing. Hold on, I'm going to get somebody up here. Excuse me. Sorry. Miss, please stand up.
Hi, I have a question. I'm just not clear on this subject, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, but it's sort of drawing on the question from the gentleman over here, where it's, 10 years from now, and yes, you were right, let's go ahead with this. But what I don't understand is that if, like, psilocybin is in the public domain and there can't be any money made off of its patent, how would a drug company that's motivated by money, by capitalism, have the incentive to manufacture the drug? And if they don't, who will? And if they do, are they going to try to mess with the chemical composition so they can have something that's like mushrooms but isn't, so that they can make money off of the patent? Like, how will that work, actually having access so widely?
You're speaking more about the medical uses, I suppose, but I mean, that's the challenge that MAPS faces. For example, they talk about themselves as Rick talks about MAPS as a non-profit pharmaceutical company, and having to get the research dollars from philanthropic private donors. There is no currently, as I'm aware, any government money coming into this line of research, and certainly Big Pharma has no interest. In fact, I would say that it's anathema to them. These are highly effective short courses of treatment with non-patented medications. It's the exact opposite of the model that pharma wants to exploit. So, yeah, that's a big challenge, but I'm optimistic, being from Canada, where we have socialized medicine and governments are on the hook for the healthcare bills, that perhaps the economic logic of getting some really effective treatments in this domain may be an avenue for greater legitimacy. So, but it is a challenge for sure.
I have a question here.
Vygotsky has a concept called the zone of proximal development, and where too much learning overwhelms and too little learning is not challenging enough to engage. What are the implications for psychedelic experience and learning?
That's a great question. I haven't actually, I think, done enough work on some of the other aspects. I really just sort of took the cognitive tool element of Vygotsky's ideas as they were developed in Kieran Egan's work and ran with them from there. I haven't actually explored that, but I think it's a great idea. I mean, that looks, I would suggest perhaps just off the cuff that, again, the ritual space with intergenerational education component might lend itself to thinking about these in the area of, you talk about the zone of proximal development, which is a bit of jargon in Vygotsky's theories, where, learning to do something, to develop a skill requires putting someone into a space where they're not shooting too far and not kind of given too little in terms of the rope, I guess, to have the freedom to explore. So I honestly, I don't know. It's a great question, and maybe you can do some further thinking and let me know.
One more question, please.
So I'm wondering whether you made a strategic choice to move from thinking about plant teachers, or talking about plant teachers, to talking about tools. And this switch from teacher to tool, I wonder whether you think that risks a focus, a shift as well from process to output, which is kind of interesting if you're thinking about teaching mystery. Like, what does it mean to teach someone to be in awe or to kind of inculcate mystery? Because in the critical pedagogies literature, you have this idea of the respecting the teacher being really important, and the teacher provoking you, and you have to make a new sense out of what they're saying, which isn't necessarily the sense that they make. So if you switch then to tools, is that important, the shift?
Absolutely. I know it's a great challenge, and it's one I've received from others as well. For sure, it was a political maneuver that I made to engage with a topic through the metaphor of plant teachers. And maybe this is the challenge. Maybe it's more than just a metaphor, right? The ontology of drinking ayahuasca and encountering a sentient being, to have that phenomenologically, that experience is very compelling, but then to try to share it with colleagues in a university department is a little, it was a step that I personally wasn't willing to take. I figured it was a little safer to go with something that was, material and something that they could maybe get their heads around. But I think, again, more work should be done in this area, and looking, again, at the traditional indigenous knowledge practices and perhaps taking them more seriously. I certainly don't want to say that we have, what modern Western scientific culture has the final word on anything related to epistemology, and that we perhaps need to, again, take these kinds of things more seriously, and that if my shift to a cognitive tool frame can help us move back in the other direction, perhaps, then it'll be, I'll have made the right choice. Maybe it'll backfire. I don't know. Right now, it's something that I'm still committed to. Thanks. Good question.
Ken Tupper, thank you so much. Thank you, Ken.